Okay, welcome Readercon viewers, wherever you happen to be in the world. This is a discussion of this year's Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award winner. Before we get to the winner, I would like to talk a little bit about the award itself. The Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award was created around the year 2000 to recognize authors who have fallen out of the general consciousness of science fiction readership, in the hopes that by getting their names out there again, it would reignite an interest in the authors and their works. For the last several years, the award was selected by a jury made up of Barry Malzberg, Mike Resnick, and Robert Sawyer. Last year, Barry and Rob decided that they'd been doing it for long enough that it was time to retire. And they reached out and asked Grant Thiessen, Rich Horton, and me, Stephen Silver, if we would be willing to take over their duties. So this is the first year that Rich, Grant, and I are sitting on the jury to select a recipient for the Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award. And we hope that you will look into this writer's work and rediscover them. So Rich, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, this year's award, Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award, goes to D.G. Compton, a British writer who was best known for his work between about 1965 and the 1990s. We thought that first and foremost, Compton's work was of outstanding quality. And at the time, he received some notice, a Nebula nomination, and a good deal of critical praise. One of his best-known books, The Continuous Catherine Morton-Ho, was made into a movie, Death Wish, by the director Bernard Tavernier. It seemed to us in discussing his work that over the past couple of decades, he has not received the attention that his work deserves. And that's exactly the sort of writer we feel should be recognized by the Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award. We should note that he has been awarded the Author Emeritus by Science Fiction Writers of America in 2007, and that his aforementioned novel, The Continuous Catherine Morton-Ho, has been reprinted by the New York Review of Books series of novels, which is an exceptional series, which I would argue is doing some of the same thing the Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award is doing, is bringing meritorious books back into print with the hopes that they reach a wider readership. Compton was born in 1930, and he is still alive. He started writing in the 1960s, established a career as a writer of detective stories under the name Guy Compton, of romances as Francis Lynch, but most prominently of science fiction, beginning in 1965. His best known novels are probably the Steel Crocodile, which received a Nebula Award nomination, and the aforementioned Continuous Catherine Morton-Ho. But several other novels received considerable praise, and his work is throughout worthy of close readership and essentially rediscovery. Let's discuss at first, I think, the general themes that his work covers. Grant, do you have an overview of that?
Compton was not really a writer of hard science fiction. He had no science background, didn't know a lot about science fiction other than that it was popular. His stories, his novels, are primarily about characters. And one thing that struck me upon rereading him was the clear delineation between his characters, and as they strove to deal with environments for which they had no preparation. Whether it's the death of Catherine Morton-Ho, or finding themselves as some of the first colonists on Mars as prisoners being deported there, or in a city that they no longer understood. All of his characters strove to try to deal with these situations, and Compton made those characterizations the major portion of his books. They're not large, long on plot. They are more a trip through an environment. And I was struck by the resemblance to some of the works of J.G. Ballard when I was rereading. And in fact, one reviewer also mentioned a Kafkaesque quality to his writing. His vocabulary is entertaining, and I think the quality of his writing is good. But for those who are expecting a lot of plot action, they should seek elsewhere. This is about the journey, not the destination.
One of the things that I found interesting is a lot of what he was writing about, readers who are coming to him fresh will already be familiar with because they've been done again and again after him. For instance, the continuous Catherine Morton. Anybody who's reading that who doesn't know anything about it will note the similarities between that and the Truman Show, for instance, a reality show. The basic idea is that Catherine Morton Ho is dying, and a television station wants to air the last weeks of her life, and so they have a reporter tagging along with her, unbeknownst to her, or she knows about it, but she thinks that she's escaped their cameras. And that idea of being in the constant eye and surveillance comes up in other works of his as well. The Steel Crocodile, surveillance is all over the place. People know that they're being wiretapped. They know that they're constantly on camera. They know that they have tails. In fact, they're friendly with their tails. So the idea that we were moving to a society, and this was written in 1970, where there was no real privacy. And I think, living in 2021, we can all relate to the idea that you are constantly under surveillance, whether it's cameras on the street, security cameras in stores, or frankly, your social media posts. Go ahead, Rich.
I was going to say, I don't think he was attempting to be prescient in that manner, but in that specific area, especially in Continuous Catherine Morton Ho, its sequel, Windows, and in Steel Crocodile, he really seems strikingly to have predicted in a very socially accurate way, let's say, reality TV and similar aspects of contemporary life.
Speaking about the social aspect of it, I was struck in reading Farewell Earth's Blitz, the similarities between people locked into a spaceship for weeks and the pandemic that we've been going through. As one of the main characters refers to, the only way that he can get through all of this is by being very rigid in his routines so that he doesn't have to think about his situation. And I was struck by the similarity with my own experiences of riding through this. However, I should put the caveat on that particular book is not politically correct today. So if you're expecting political correctness from him, no, he reflected the mores of his time.
So now, I did find the books that I reread in preparation for today to be somewhat bleak for the most part. In reading those books, there wasn't a whole lot of humor or levity in them, which I don't know if that's a reflection of Compton, if it's a reflection of the society he was portraying or his view of the society. I think it has more to do with the societies he was portraying, because I also read 2 radio plays that he wrote and published, and those actually were somewhat humorous. They didn't necessarily work for me entirely, but there was definitely humor coming through there that was missing from his novels.
I
I
think,
agree with that because I think the situations that he puts his characters in are bleak. And so the text of his novels reflected that. I too
I-
found very little humor.
and I think whether he knew much about science fiction or not, I think and perhaps coming to it fresh, is not particularly a particular fan of it. He was able to, I think, quite consciously use near future situations in a way to, as much science fiction tries to do, he's able to do it without the burden, I think, of being in conversation with the books he read as a kid, that sort of thing, to set up situations that really did reflect social concerns that he had and also the lives of his characters. To return to continuous Catherine Mortenho, the two major characters, Catherine Mortenho herself and the reporter with the embedded camera who follows her around, their characters are very deftly and sympathetically portrayed, even if they're, particularly the reporter is not necessarily, at least initially, a very good person, but he is portrayed with great understanding. And really that's true of even the minor characters that he portrays. He was one of the really fine, small scale writers of character in SF at that period.
Yeah, well, Rod, the reporter in Catherine Mortenho, as you say, he starts out very not unlikable, but unsympathetic a character. And I think he grows more, more through the book than you really expect, to the point where he becomes heroic by the end, which is the thing that allowed Compton to use him as the main character in a sequel novel that came out around the time that Mortenho was made into the movie Death Watch, which, by the way, horrible title for the movie. It does not sound like what it is at all.
You're looking for Charles Bronson to show up.
Exactly. I found the title off-putting, but of course, knowing that it was based on Compton's book, when I watched it, it's very much a movie of its time. It was made in, I think, 78, 79, and it has that feel. I think it was filmed in Scotland, but it feels like a movie from the 70s, but very well done for what it is, and definitely pointing towards things like EdTV and The Truman Show.
I was struck, you made the comment earlier, Grant, of his resemblance to Ballard in some ways, especially his second novel, The Silent Multitudes, set in a literally decaying English town. It could have been the next novel Ballard chose to do after novels like The Crystal World. Ballard was taking his fiction in a slightly different direction. So it's almost like Compton was proceeding in the direction Ballard initially went. But it's a striking, quiet novel, a true cozy catastrophe, to use the term, in its less pejorative sense, because some cozy catastrophes kind of forgive, they kind of redeem their characters even as the whole world is collapsing. And there's no such redemption in Silent Multitudes, but there is sympathy and a very bleak but humanistic look at the end of the world.
I would like to point out something also, that his first books were published in the Ace Science Fiction special series, which Terry Carr had a strong influence on, if he wasn't the actual editor of every book in that series.
Mm.
And the idea of the Ace Science Fiction specials was to move science fiction into new directions. As important an editor as Terry Carr was, he could recognize in Compton that this was a worthy author to be part of that series.
Yeah. The other thing is, Rich, you were talking about how his books read, that one book reads like a cozy. I would say that a lot of his works, not all of them, but a lot of them don't read like science fiction at all. They could almost be read as a slightly alternative contemporary novel. And that's partly because, as Grant pointed out, his focus on the characters rather than the technology. I mean, in The Steel Crocodile, the main character, Dr. Oliver, is brought on board a think tank, essentially. And you never really get the feel that he understands what's going on there or why he's brought on. He's referred to as an expert, but you never really see that expertise. It's much more about him trying to figure out what's going on, in the facility, his relationship with his wife, and so on, and of course with his tales. And so you read it, and it doesn't read like a thriller because, as Grant pointed out, there's not that much action in it. But it doesn't read like science fiction either.
Or like science fiction that we grew up expecting, which I think he was a fairly successful writer in his time, but never a superstar, and that was undoubtedly one reason for it. Although he had, after the Ace years, he was published in later years by Daw and by Pocket Books. Yeah, I don't actually know why he stopped writing in the 90s, but he was still doing strong work.
Right. Well, his last work was a short story that appeared in Patrick Nelson Hayden's anthology Starlight 3. And Rich, you mentioned that the New York Times book review reprinted Catherine Mortenhoe.
New York Review of Books.
New York Review of Books. And Gateway did do an omnibus of his that includes his novels Steel Crocodile, Synthojoy, and Ascendancies. And I think they also did a separate issue of Windows, which is the sequel to Catherine Mortenhoe. But those are mostly available in the UK, so that any US readership he had is going to be looking in used bookstores to find any of his works. And they're available, at inexpensive prices. So he is accessible if you know to look for him. And with luck, him being a recipient of the Cordwainer Smith Award will give people the impetus to go out and seek him out.
One of the things we discussed when we were surveying the people that we think are worthy of this award, and there are sadly perhaps quite a few, I think, very worthy possibilities, was the fact that he's English, and I think he still maintains, as you know, a reasonable reputation in England. They don't sense the same attention being paid to him in the United States. Although he has proponents like Jeff Vandermeer, who wrote the introduction to the NYRB reissue of Continuous Catherine Mortenhoe. So, that is a real hope here that because he really was one of the really fine writers of that particular period, mainly the 60s and 70s into the 80s. And he should be getting the attention that we hope we're giving him. I'm going to make one notice. If you're looking for his books in used bookstores and you're looking for the Continuous Catherine Mortenhoe, you might find it instead as The Unsleeping Eye, which was the title of both the Daw edition, because Don Moheim couldn't help himself to change titles, and of this pocketbook edition that I found in a used bookstore many years ago when I was trying to discover his works.
And after the movie came out, it was also reissued as Death Watch. So
Correct.
3 different titles. One of the other things that's interesting is, and this may be because of the way he came to science fiction, not in the stereotypical way of being a fan and reading it and then writing it, but because he jumped in. He has very few short stories. He's published only 7 short stories that I'm aware of, starting in 1965 with a story called Sarah, and ending up with a story called In Which Abu Giddy Tries to Stop Dancing in Nielsen Hayden's collection. And a couple of the stories are actually horror rather than science fiction. So again, you can track those down. They haven't been collected. I think a couple of them may have been reprinted, but for the most part, you'll be looking for the original issues of those stories.
Right. He may well been a writer who's true métier was a novel anyway. It's there are writers who are natural novelists and writers who are natural short story writers, and writers who do both with equal facility.
Well, and I did mention that he wrote radio plays, and two of them were collected in a thin chapbook back in 1988 called, cleverly enough, Radio Plays. And he has commented that he loved radio plays, but he got into writing them right around the time that they were going out of fashion because of television. But my understanding is that at least some of them were performed on the radio. The radio play, at least one of the radio plays that is collected in Radio Plays, was performed, had a live reading at a British science fiction convention. And the two I read, they work. The first one, it's a little bit obvious where it's coming from, where it's going. It's kind of a mistaken identity radio play. And the second one is about two spinster women who have a secret, and there's a certain amount of time slippage in it. So though they are science fictional, and unlike the novels, they show that Compton does have a sense of humor and understands what funny is. And they form a nice bit of levity after reading some of his novels.
Although even a novel like Continuous Catherine Morton, which I keep returning to because it is my favorite among his works, we talk about him as not being that science fictional writer, but there are some very nicely done little background touches. Like, you do not realize as you start reading the book that Catherine Morton's terminal illness is almost unprecedented in that era. It's an era where death has essentially been eliminated except by old age. And of course, there's a twist going on there too, but I won't get into that.
Right, and whereas he does explain that, it doesn't really hit home until the sequence with Catherine Morton-Hoe's, I think it's her grandfather, who is older. And I like it because it's world building that you don't realize it's going on necessarily. Right. He does not, as you know, Bob, at any point. It's subtle, and I think again that may be the fact that he wasn't familiar with a lot of the tropes of science fiction. In one interview that I read, he said, "I knew I was going to be writing science fiction. I didn't know a whole lot about it, so I threw in a spaceship, or I threw in a robot." And again, those elements are not always necessarily the important part. It's not what he was interested in writing about. He was interested in writing about the relationships between people and between people and the society in which they moved.
But that was important in a way that many science fiction stories has been often noted. Many science fiction stories are really about the present time in which they are written, or the near past, which is natural because that's what authors really truly know, right? And they're using science fictional tropes to illuminate character or society, or whatever else the author is interested in getting to. That's exactly what Compton's doing. But in a way, Compton was able to do that more naturally than maybe an author who couldn't help but be interested in the science fictional tropes, even as he was telling a character story, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And part of it also means that when you're reading one of Compton's stories, if you were asked when it takes place, I don't think you could really answer. Is this a contemporary 1970 that the Steel Crocodile takes place? Or does the Steel Crocodile take place in some amorphous future, 1980, 1990, 2020? You can't tell, and it doesn't matter.
Right. It might be fair to say that many of them appear to be set in the present time, except that the timeline has been altered so that the science fictional elements have come into existence in that time. And we're never given a calendar date, so that's not necessarily the case. And that seems like a failing in some writers, but in Compton's work, it is what it is, and it allows him to portray his characters as naturally as possible, I think.
Well, it also allows him to comment very fully on his own time.
Mhm.
Because when reading Morton Ho or The Steel Crocodile or some of these other things, um, it was very much in my mind when he was writing and what was going on. The fact that it was shortly after the 60s when there was an upheaval going through society. It was at a time where there was a certain conservatism that was juxtaposed by a liberal tendency in social aspect mores. Um, and there were cultural institutions that were still hanging on, but their end was in the near future. That was very much in my mind when I was reading these, and I was seeing how he was playing around with those ideas.
I know in the one of the books that I read, homophobia was one of the issues that a character was dealing with, and another one was racism, but presented in a way that these were problems that should be gone beyond, that these weren't the important issues about the people. And
And
also,
one thing that
with his
I
use
didn't
of-
do, and I don't know that any of us did this, but I'd be interested in seeing it, in finding his romances and his crime novels and comparing them to science fiction.
That would be interesting, and partly because the romances that he wrote as Francis Lynch came out in the mid-70s. When he was still writing a lot of science fiction, they were interspersed with them. In fact, Death Watch, the movie, came out while his romance novels were coming out, and so of course, Windows, the science fiction sequel to Catherine Morton Ho, came out during that time. His Alec Duncan books were actually the last couple things that he wrote that came out in the mid-90s. So by that time, the science fiction was behind him, as far as being published. I haven't had a chance to look those up, but it could be interesting to see, how those changed.
And his mysteries were published primarily before he turned into science fiction, beginning in 62 and ending in 66, I believe, by
Right.
publication anyway.
One thing that I wanted to do, and I'm looking up the full title just because I think it's fun, and that's one of his novels, Chronicles, was actually originally published, I believe, in New Worlds under this impressive title, which I think he did partly just for kicks. Hot wireless sets, aspirin tablets, the sandpaper size of used matchboxes, and something that might have been castor oil. So that is perhaps the longest title of a science fiction novel that I can think of offhand. But naturally it was quickly retitled a much snappier, shorter title.
Although I'm not sure how much Chronicles, rolls off the tongue.
Right. Badly enough that the initial Ace publication misspelled it with an I. And later it's been corrected, so it's spelled chronocules, not chronicules. But,
Oh, okay. I was trying to decide where the I was. I kind of figured it would be chronokyles.
yeah.
So anyway, this is our initial outing as the jury for the Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award, and we discussed several people and really felt that DG Compton was worth people taking time to go look up and find. I hope that what we've said here gives you a reason to search him out and take a look at some of his books. So, Grant or
Right.
Rich?
I think it truly is rewarding. I read several of his books many years ago and rediscovered a couple of them over the past few weeks. And it's striking how good a writer he was. And it's sad that, at least in the US, he's been certainly not forgotten, but drifted into some degree of neglect that I hope we can do something to counteract.
I hope we can continue to present authors of this quality and of the quality that other authors who have previously won the Cordwainer Smith Award, so that we can recognize authors whose contributions to science fiction are perhaps moving in their own unique directions, as certainly as Cordwainer Smith did.
That's an excellent point. One of the concerns that runs through my head, was the idea that an award like this could be seen as a left-handed compliment, and that is not at all what we think. It's more writers who stand with any writer in the field's history, but for some reason, most obviously, as you point out, Grant, that their particular concerns, their style, their approach was unique enough to themselves that they never achieved complete popularity and are easy to forget if you don't keep your eye on them. But the quality of their works, true of many of the Cordwainer Smith Award winners, are writers like one very recently, Carol Emschwell, or much earlier, R.A. Lafferty. These are among the greatest science fiction writers we've ever had, but still were felt to need some degree of rediscovery. And that's what I like to think about D.G. Compton. And as we've discussed, and it's sad in a way, but it's a natural progress of literary evolution, I suppose, that we are confident that we have a list of writers we're looking at that I think will be of equal stature for future awards.
Yeah. And part of it is that there are so many new writers coming out these days. The changes in the publishing industry mean that you can, it used to be you could read everything in the field, and that went by the wayside decades ago. Now you can't even read everything in a specific subgenre. And frankly, I think there were probably some authors who couldn't even read everything that they've written. But it's important to discover new authors, and that means new authors who are writing their first stories and novels right now, and new authors who wrote decades ago who you had never heard of. And with luck, the Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award can help with that latter category. And you'll be able to learn about the new authors who are writing today from word of mouth. But it's important, I think, to remember where we came from. And as we said with Compton, a lot of the ideas that he was writing about in the 60s and 70s, people are still writing about in the 2020s. They may or may not know that they're building on what he wrote about. But seeing what he was doing with it 30, 40 years ago is eye-opening.
No pun intended, I trust.
Pun is always intended. Okay, so once again, thank you very much. If we were at Readercon in person at this point, we would probably open up to some questions, but I don't think we have time, and it's kind of hard to take questions in this particular format. So thank you all for watching, and go out and check out your local used bookstore or one of the online used bookstores and pick up some books by D.G. Compton.
And with any luck, next year, if we're back, we'll be able to be back live at Readercon. Something I'm looking forward to, at any rate.
That would be nice.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.